So I'm trying to now, in this talk, which I fortunately had a chance to give, I'm trying to kind of work through some of these issues that are making me bothered, and maybe you will have some good suggestions or thoughts of your own of how to resolve some of these questions I have. So let's start with very basic stuff. What is post-editing? Some of the basic definitions that have been used. Now, this is by no means not the only one, but is a fairly commonly used definition from the international standard ISO 18587, which is an international standard on post-editing services. The definition itself comes from another standard, the ISO 17100, which focuses on translation services in general, and then the 18587 is a more specialized one focusing on post-editing services specifically. And the way these two standards define post-editing, or in the verb form to post-edit, it is simply to edit and correct machine translation output. And you can find other definitions out there as said, but very often this is the basic idea that we're working with. So there is some sort of a machine translation raw version that the post editor, or very often a translator, then takes and edits as necessary. We can contrast this with a couple of other definitions from the standards ISO 17100, where to translate is defined as render source language content into target language content in written form. And I find it quite curious, first of all, that post-editing seems to move away from this idea. Isn't the person who is doing post-editing, whether we call them a translator or a post-editor, isn't this person also rendering source language content into target language content in written form? They're just doing it in a slightly different way. So the definition for post-editing seems to center the machine translation output. That's the key issue here. Another term and definition that we can take a look at is revision, which also involves editing and correcting something. But in this case, we are dealing with a translation produced by another human, commonly at least. So revision is defined in the standard as a bilingual examination of target language content against source language content for its suitability for the agreed purpose. And here, there would seem to be some similarities between post-editing and revision, right? In both cases, you have some kind of an output that has already been translated, and there is editing and correcting involved. But again, the definitions are quite different. So also for revision, we are focusing on source language content and target language content, and then working with those. For post-editing, as said, we're only discussing the machine translation output here. So is post-editing like translating, or is it like revision, or is it actually the same thing as translating, or is it the same thing as revision? One thing we can look at is the need for changes. So what is it that needs to be changed when you are revising or when you are post-editing? If you are revising a translation, so with the assumption that what is being revised is a translation produced by another human, Brian Mossop's work, for example, defines it so that you will need to change things if there are omissions or mistranslations, terminology issues, so-called translationese, non-standard language, or similar issues. Now, during translation, you may be changing things as well, especially when using translation memory matches, which we know translators very commonly nowadays use. You will need to change something if the translation memory match contains some differences related to the source text. So there is, for example, a different term is used, or some other slight difference in the source texts, comparing the new segment being translated and the segment you can find in the translation memory match. And of course, when dealing with translation memory matches, you will also need to check for potential omissions, mistranslations, terminology issues, translation ease, and non-standard language. I do remember one of my students some years ago writing an essay about translation memory use. So, you know, reusing these translations that somebody else has already done and then saved in the translation memory. And the student noted that the best thing about translation memories is that it guarantees that the translation is of good quality. And I was like, well, not really. I mean, it is very much a garbage in, garbage out situation. So just sitting in the translation memory is not going to make the translation good. You do end up with situations where there may be poor translations in the translation memory. And then, as said, you will need to check for these issues. Now then, when working with machine translation or when post-editing, so what are the things that you need to correct or edit? Omissions, additions made by the machine translation system, mistranslations, terminology issues, something that is commonly referred to as machine translationese. So features caused by the way machine translations work, non-standard language, and so on. So in many ways, you are dealing with rather similar issues. We could, of course, ask, so are the errors produced by another human doing the translation or a machine translation system, are they similar or are they different? There are probably, especially nowadays with neural machine translation systems, we are seeing some similarities there. So we know, for example, that machine translation systems may disambiguate words incorrectly and use the wrong equivalent. Well, that can happen to a translator as well. Especially if you don't have enough context, it might be difficult to select the right word, or otherwise sometimes mistakes happen. On the other hand, I have also seen machine translation systems making errors that I don't think a human would make. I can't necessarily prove this, but let's say, for example, one situation I remember where the Finnish word viherpippuri, which means a green pepper. No, sorry, the other way around. So the original word was viherpeippo, which is a type of a bird, a green finch, if I remember correctly. And that was translated using the word green pepper, so viherpippuri, which is quite similar to the Finnish word, but obviously not the same thing. And I think there is a difference there in that a human translator would more likely make an error where they use the wrong name for a bird. But so far, at least working with translators and working with my translation students, I haven't so far come across a situation where they would translate a bird as a pepper. So there may be some differences in the errors as well. Well, what about the competencies that we expect from people doing translating and post-editing? So I'm going back to these standards again. The ISO 17100, the General Translation Services Standard, defines that a translator should have translation competence, linguistic and textual competence, research information acquisition and processing competence, cultural competence, technical competence, and domain competence. There we go. A reviser, so somebody who is revising translations, should, according to the standard, have pretty much the same competencies as translators. In addition, the standard mentioned that they should also have some competence in revising translations specifically. If we take the post-editing service standard, that one states that post-editors should actually have the same competencies as translators and revisers. You will pretty much find the same list in that post-editing standard. And in addition, these post editors should have specific competencies that relate to post editing. Now, some of the things that relate specifically to post editing could be, for example, under the technical competence. So some competencies that relate specifically to working with machine translation. So understanding how machine translation systems work, not necessarily as a programmer yourself, but on the level of understanding how to use them and what the features of MT mean for post editing. There are also suggestions by others, such as Anthony Pem has talked about how working with machine translation and also actually translation memories requires specific competencies, for example, to evaluate the source where the translation suggestion is coming from. It also involves competencies like recognizing and working with errors that cross sentence border. So something that you only notice if you're looking at a sentence in the larger context. So here again, there are some hints that perhaps post-editing is actually the same thing as translating if the competencies that we're expecting from these people are the same. Okay, so much for basic definitions. So what about translators and machine translation at work? What is it that they actually do? How do translators work with machine translation? Now, here is one example of a so-called translators workbench. This is a screenshot from MemSource from a while ago. So if you go there right now, it might look different. This is not intended in any sort of promotional capacity. This just happened to be a screenshot I had easily available. So commonly, this is the environment where a translator, especially when dealing with technical or administrative texts, this is where the translator works. So if you're not familiar with how these translators workbench tools look like, here on the left, that is the source text that is being translated, and it has been divided into translation units, which can be very commonly sentences, but also other types of segments. So for example, here we see the heading, antivirus user guide, and then chapter headings like chapter 1 overview and so on. Then in the column next to that, here we have a Finnish translation of those source text segments. And then we can see their information for where these segments are coming from. So we have both translation memory suggestions. Here the 100, meaning that this is an exact match or 100% match coming from a translation memory. So the segment installation occurs already in the memory as such and has been translated into Finnish as asentaminen. Then the yellow TBs indicate term bases, so terminology resources, where we can see that we find terms like install and installation, and their Finnish equivalents asentaa ja asennus. And then also we have machine translation suggestions. So the machine translation is suggesting that installation should be translated as asennus. I won't go very deep into this. I would say in this particular case, in Finnish, you could use either one. So both the translation memory suggestion asentaminen and the machine translation version asennus could work perfectly well here. So this is the kind of context where the translator would be working in, and you have all kinds of additional information, how exact the match is. So in addition to 100% matches, we have 99%. I even have a 57% match there just for demonstration purposes and so forth. So this is where a translator who works with machine translation would quite commonly be working. There are suggestions coming from different places. Now, if we go back to that definition of post-editing, it just says very simply that post-editing means editing and correcting machine translation output. And what this seems to imply is a very straightforward workflow. So you have a source text, then that gets machine translated, and then it gets post-edited, and then you have the target text. Right, there we go. However, many workflows that translators actually work in are not quite that straightforward. Generally, what you have going on is that there is, well, source content instead of necessarily a full source text coming in. There is target content coming out at some point. There in the middle, we have our translator. And the translator is getting all of these pieces of information from different places. So there's the term-based TB there at the bottom, translation memory, TM, machine translation, MT, as we saw. Those two are, or actually all three are working side by side there in the translation tools. The translator is doing post-editing. The post-edited segments are then being added into the translation memory. Sometimes the machine translation suggestions, if they are good enough not to require any changes, are going into the translation memory as they are. And all of these resources are getting mixed up. And this is still actually a simple workflow. We only have one translator here. We have one translation memory, one machine translation system, and some sort of clearly defined source and target content. So you could have larger projects where you have multiple translators working at the same time using the same translation memory, for example, and you're getting the different post-edited versions from everybody into the translation memory, perhaps even at the same time or at slightly different times. So this is even a simplified picture. Then we may also have workflows that involve different type of data. So here, a quick mention of a research project which I worked for in 2019 and 2020. Called MEMAD, Methods for Managing Audiovisual Data. And what we were working with was various types of, as it says, audiovisual data. So basically videos, for example, news clips, current affairs videos and such. So let's say our translator is actually working on subtitles. They're creating subtitles for this audiovisual content, news clip, for example. So we got audio, we have video there. What happens in those workflows? So we worked with news translators and in an environment where very commonly first you have somebody doing intralingual subtitles, so the subtitles in the same language as the audio. You can use automated speech recognition as support for that. This is something that we explored in the MEMAD project, for example. And then you have subtitles in the same language as the audio. You can have directly from the ASR subtitles, or you can use the ASR and then have the subtitler post-edit those and then create the final intralingual subtitles. Then let's say we want interlingual subtitles. So for example, a Finnish news clip gets translated into English or vice versa. You very often, at least in the environment where we worked, you have another person who will translate it. They can translate it in different ways. In some cases, they might start with the intralingual subtitles that somebody else has already created. Or very often in this news context where our participants worked, they actually start directly from the audio. So they don't have the intralingual subtitles, or they don't wait for the intralingual subtitles to start doing their translation. Rather, they work directly from the audio and then translate it into the written subtitles. You can have machine translation involved in this workflow, which is also something we experimented with in MEMAD. So we tried different routes. For example, going from the audio with automated speech recognition to intralingual subtitles to machine translation. Those can be made directly into interlingual, so translated subtitles. I can give you a brief recap here that it did not work well. So the tools, at least for Finnish when Finnish is involved in the language pair, they were not very successful at creating fully automated subtitles. So rather, you will have the translator take the machine translation output and post-edit it. We tried that both with the ASR generated source text. The translators were not happy with that. The combination of first ASR and then machine translation was quite poor and annoying to work with. Or another option we experimented with and which worked better was to have the intralingual subtitles that have been created by a human subtitler, or at least post-edited by the human subtitler, and then have those machine translated and have the translator then create interlingual subtitles from those. So this is a slightly more complicated situation. And as said, also here, you could have many different people involved. And of course, so far, I've only been talking about using the audio and what happens with the subtitles. But of course, since this is an audio-visual situation, both the intralingual subtitler and then the subtitle translator need to take into account what's happening in the video. And we also worked with other things such as creating audio descriptions of the video and also automated content descriptions using computer vision. So there's a lot going on in these workflows. So this just to demonstrate that this assumption of post-editing being a very straightforward process where you have a source text, then it's machine translated, then it's post-edited, and there's your target text. It doesn't necessarily match up with what's going on in real life situations, or at least not in all real life situations. Now, another issue is that the tools are getting more complex and changing as well. So earlier there, I was talking as if translation memory and machine translation are somehow separate from each other. They're not necessarily. So there are things happening, like, for example, machine translation is used to do so-called translation memory repair. So to identify the differences in the source text and then generate suggestions where those differences are already taken into account. We have systems for adaptive machine translation, which instead of being these static systems, which the translators find very, very annoying to work with, because once you've made a correction to one machine translated segment, you're going to run into the same error in the next segment again, because the machine translation does not learn. So to solve that, there are systems that do actually learn from what the translator is doing, and at least the hope there is that the machine doesn't keep making the same errors over and over again, so that the translator has to correct them over and over again. Interactive machine translation could be considered a special type of adaptive machine translation, so where the MT system is actually learning and changing in real time as the translator is typing the corrections or entering the corrections into the translation. So the idea here being that these types of systems will be able to adapt to the corrections made by the translators, and also adapt to the context of the document. So that's the other part. The quotation from the modern MT screenshot. So again, here LILT and modern MT as examples of these types of systems. So with all of this, things are getting more and more complicated. So if we have this situation where the translator is getting information or getting these suggestions from many different resources at the same time, let's say in one segment, you are using a translation memory match. In the next segment, you are using a machine translation suggestion. In the next one, maybe you have something in the middle. So there is a TM match that has been repaired using the machine translation. If you're working with these adaptive and interactive systems, their output keeps changing all the time. So which part of this is post-editing? Is all of it post-editing or is none of it post-editing? Now, going back to this definition that I've already shown you a couple of times. So editing and correcting machine translation output. There's actually a note in the main ISO 17100 standard, so the one that deals with translation services in general, where the note, so you can see a screenshot here, I'm not just making this up. It says post-editing, so this term does not refer to a situation where a translator sees and uses a suggestion from machine translation engine within a CAT, computer-aided translation tool. In ISO 18587, this note has been deleted. It's not there, but since it references ISO 17100, the situation is, shall we say, slightly unclear of what's going on here. So thinking back to this whole workflow that I've been discussing here and these different resources that the translator is using and how they are all getting mixed up together. And I have to say, I'm not quite sure how much post-editing is actually happening outside of CAT tools. At least, well, I am not currently, and I have not for a while now been working actively as a translator myself, but kind of what I'm hearing from the field, at least with my contacts here in Finland, is that if you're doing post-editing, you are most likely using a CAT tool. So something like MemSource or a similar tool to do it. So if by definition, we're ruling that out, that is not post-editing, then what is it? And there are others, of course, who have pointed this out. I'm by no means the first one to question what's going on and what we actually should be calling this process. There are suggestions, for example, to talk about human post-editing. So this would refer to working with translation memory matches, and then post-editing machine translation or machine translation post-editing, so making a distinction there. Another suggestion along the similar lines is to talk about post-editing TM matches and post-editing MT matches, so calling also the machine translation suggestions matches. But these also have the problem that they are still making this distinction between MT and not MT. Whereas, as we can see in these workflows, everything gets mixed up. So Sharon O'Brien, for example, has talked about just translation as human-computer interaction more generally. Others like Ale Lommel, for example, have suggested the term augmented translation to refer to basically these technology-mediated platforms and environments where translators work. So although we started out with this clear and simple definition, it's not quite that simple, or at least in my opinion, it's not quite that simple. There have been some discussions happening where I've been part lately where we talk about, so does post-editing even exist in the sense defined in these standards? So if we are ruling out situations where computer-assisted tools are used, if we are ruling out situations where the machine translation and translation memory are there side by side, then what's left? What is this post-editing that the standard ISO 18587, for example, talks about? And how much is that actually happening out there in the field? Okay, so far my main problem with post-editing has been kind of nomenclature and definition. So what is this thing that we call post-editing? And more recently, I have ended up with this question of, does it even exist? But let's try and make this a bit more concrete. So what's actually happening in post-editing? So the translators or post-editors who are doing this, they are editing something. I think we can, to some extent, agree with that. So they're making some kinds of changes or edits. And again, going to some definitional issues or questions of guidelines. So here, as an example, guidelines defined for post-editing, how to do post-editing. This version from TAUS, formerly known as Translator Automation User Society. And they give these kind of fairly concrete guidelines for what the person doing post-editing should actually be doing. And as is quite common, they define two different levels. So you can approach this from two slightly different angles. So you can talk about either human translation quality versus good enough quality. So there are two levels focusing on what the output is expected to be. Or then to talk about full post-editing and light post-editing, which very often gets combined here. So that the expectation is that full post-editing would correspond to human translation quality and light post-editing would correspond to this good enough quality. The difference here being also these are defined in slightly different ways in slightly different places. But a common idea between making the distinction is that for the human translation quality, or some call it publication quality or full post-editing, you should basically aim for what you would expect to get from a professional translator. So things like a text that is grammatically, syntactically, and semantically correct, ensuring that correct terminology is used, nothing has been added or omitted accidentally, editing offensive or inappropriate content. Basic rules regarding spelling, punctuation, and hyphenation, ensure that formatting is correct. For good enough quality, some of these requirements are dropped. So the aim is that the translation should be semantically correct. So something that is understandable, conveys the meaning that it should. So you would need to check things like no information accidentally added or omitted. Also mentions the offensive or inappropriate content. Basic rules regarding spelling apply. However, there's no need to implement stylistic corrections, no need to improve the flow of the text. As long as it's understandable and says what it's supposed to say, then you're dealing with a good enough quality. Now, both of these lists include the instruction, use as much of the raw MT output as possible. And this, of course, relates to the idea that what you should be doing is only editing errors. So only things that absolutely need to be corrected. If it's not wrong, then don't correct it. And with this in mind, there are various authors who have, for example, analyzed what people do during post-editing and tried to see whether there are so-called unnecessary edits or preferential edits. So making these distinctions of what is actually an error, so something that definitely needs to be corrected, versus what is a preferential or unnecessary edit, so something that was already correct in the machine translation, but the post editor just changed it for some reason, because it sounds better, because it flows better. So especially when we're dealing with this light post editing and good enough notion, then of course the idea behind it is that, you know, don't make any corrections that you're not supposed to make. I'm not going to start explaining the table here. This is from a study that I did together with my colleagues Leena Salmi and Markku Nikulin. We examined some corrections made by translation students while post-editing. And as you can see, we were trying this whole distinction of necessary and unnecessary changes, and noticed that our student participants were actually making a whole lot of so-called unnecessary changes. So the machine translation as such would have already been correct. Now, of course, the whole question of what is necessary or unnecessary, what is essential or what is preferential, that is a slippery concept. Not necessarily everybody agrees on what needs to be corrected and what not. Quite clearly so, because if you give different post editors the same machine translation, they're very often going to be making slightly different changes. Now, another issue is that the idea behind this instruction to use as much of the MT content as you possibly can, don't make any unnecessary changes, is that it should be faster. So the reasoning for using machine translation and post editing in general is, you know, productivity, efficiency. It makes things faster. However, here, this table, on the other hand, represents some of the process data that we collected from these same students who participated in that study. And here the highlights. So green is always things like shortest post editing time. So the 5 shortest post editing times, the 5 lowest key logging events. So those who did least typing, and then the number of edited words. So again, highlighted in green, the 5 who made the fewest changes. And in red are the longest times and the highest number of key logging events and the highest number of edited words in the same text. And in some cases, so there are rows where the greens and the reds do actually match up. So somebody who is among the fastest makes the smallest number of changes and has the smallest number of keyboard events. And on the other hand, the slowest ones have a higher number of keyboard events and the highest number of words changed. But this doesn't always apply. So there is, for example, person P07, who is actually the slowest at 39 minutes, is actually kind of average if we look at the keylogging events and the number of words edited. Quite interestingly, then we have somebody like P13 there, for example, who is among the slowest, but also one of the 5 with the smallest numbers of keyboard events. So this assumption that the less you edit, the faster you are, it doesn't necessarily apply here. Well, of course, these are students, and there are all kinds of complications that I won't go into right now because we don't have the time. For example, the keyboard events include things like moving around in the text to be post-edited. So it's not necessarily deleting and typing as such that is getting recorded here. And this is not something that happens just with our group of students. Here a comparison from the MEMAD project, which I mentioned. So we experimented with some of these news translators who were post-editing machine translated subtitles. And also here, so we have here 4 different language pairs translating from Finnish to English, English to Finnish, Finnish to Swedish, and Swedish to Finnish, and then 3 participants in each case, and these are their average task times and average number of keystrokes used. And there are some interesting observations that could be made here. I'm not going to discuss them in more detail, but so if you are interested, these results are addressed in the paper cited there. But also here, something we notice is that the person who makes the least corrections is not necessarily the fastest one. And we had one participant, for example, who was very, very fast, but made a lot of corrections. So basically rewrote the subtitles completely and still made it faster than the others. And this may seem at first unintuitive, but if we think about it, it's not necessarily that difficult to explain. So going back all the way to Hans Kring's studies and his distinction of different types of post-editing effort. So if we're measuring temporal effort, only part of that is the technical effort. So things like making corrections, typing, and so forth. The other half is the cognitive effort involved. So the effort that you need to spend to read the machine translated version, to identify where the errors are, and to make the decisions how you're going to correct them. And even if machine translation reduces the technical effort, so reduces the amount of typing you have to do, it doesn't necessarily reduce the cognitive effort. And one reason, for example, our participants who was very, very fast, despite basically retranslating the whole thing, is that they didn't spend time on the cognitive effort of identifying the errors. They basically just, and this is something that we actually know from then interviewing this translator after the fact. Basically, the approach was to just notice that, well, this machine translated subtitle is not good. I'm just going to translate it the way that I would, even without the machine translation. So turns out, maybe that's actually the most efficient way to work. We did have quite a bit of quality struggles. So of course, this all depends on what level of machine translation quality you are dealing with, also what the situation is. Another complication here was that, again, when we had these interviews with the translators after the experiments, pretty much all of them noted that the machine translation as such, like as text, was not that bad. The problem was that it was not working as subtitles, because when subtitling audiovisual content, you generally need to condense things. So things need to be omitted. They need to be rephrased in some other way that allows you to have the number of characters that fit into one subtitles and can be shown on the screen for the required time. So that was one of the challenges, not that the machine translation quality as such was necessarily so poor, but that it was not suitable for the subtitling environment. All right, I've used quite a bit of time, so I'm coming to the end of my talk here. So at the end, it is customary in presentations to end with some conclusions, which I'm not going to do. Instead, I'm going to be presenting you with questions. So the questions that are and have been bothering me about post-editing is, first of all, what do we even mean when we talk about post-editing? So what is this thing? I was talking about there about the different workflows and different ways of interacting with machine translation. And as I already said there, so which parts of this are post-editing and which parts are not? Are they something else? Is it just translating, or what do we call this? Should we even talk about post-editing at all, or is there actually a better term that we should be using for the work of a translator interacting with machine translation? I will say directly that myself, for a long time, I have been, let's say, kind of agnostic to this thought. My thinking has been kind of like, well, does it really matter what we call it? Don't we all know what's going on? Like, doesn't matter. So we have somebody who's working with machine translation. Let's call it post-editing, so what? But with all of this ambiguity and confusion about what's actually going on, perhaps it does actually matter. Perhaps we should be able to kind of define more specifically what it is that post-editing actually is. This could relate also to discussions about things like compensation. For example, there is this idea out there that post-editing is somehow very easy, it's very quick, it can be easily used to reduce costs, and you don't need to pay post-editors that much. So maybe the concept or the term post-editing is also problematic in that sense. And these assumptions of it being easy and quick, and there are even some suggestions that anybody can do it. You don't need to have any translator competencies for post-editing. I know that there are some who, for that reason, want to move away from the term post-editing and call this way of working with machine translation in its myriad forms, call it something else. So PR in a sense. And then the third question that I've been getting at here is, so regardless of what we end up calling this, what is actually an effective way to approach it? For example, I teach translation students who obviously want to know, so how should I be doing post-editing? I also get questions from translators who are already in the field. So, okay, how should I post-edit? What's the most efficient and most effective way? And my answer nowadays is, I'm not sure I know. I can tell you what the guidelines say, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best way to work. Like, you will have to figure it out depending on your own situation, your own workflows, the type of texts you are working with. So there are so many ways to affect that. Maybe there are situations where our subtitling translators approach of just discard it all and write your own translation. That might be the most efficient way to work. All right, so I will end here. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will be happy to take those. I don't know if I can answer them, or if you have any answers to my questions, I would be very happy to hear those too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koponen. We see that Dr. Kobe has a question. He raised his hand already.
Actually, thank you. Actually, I don't have a question. I have comments.
Okay.
Specifically, oops, sorry. Specifically, I work with the ASTM Standards Committee, F2575, for the new revision of the Standard Guide for Quality Assurance. And we've been discussing this issue specifically. And we do make a difference between post-editing being between post-editing and what translators do when they accept machine translation suggestions. And the key difference in our discussions is that post-editing does occur. It is done in a CAT tool, but the difference is that the machine is the generator of the text. So when you're post-editing machine translation output, I do this as a professional translator actually fairly frequently. You receive a Trados package, a CAT tool package, and you load it into your CAT tool, and you do exactly what you said. You try to preserve as much of the machine translation content as possible, because you're not accepting suggestions for the MT. The MT has been done and you're just revising it. You just happen to be doing it in a CAT tool. So that definition really depends on who is responsible. If you get a complete MT text and you are fixing it, that's post-editing. Whereas if you are translating a text, you have been assigned to translate a text, and your CAT tool is providing MT suggestions in the same context as TM suggestions, I don't think we should call that post-editing. I think we should call that, accepting suggestions from various sources and revising them. But the key difference is that the human is creating the text and accepting or rejecting suggestions. So that's the big answer is, is that, and that kind of answers question 1 and question 2. My second comment is that we do need to make a difference between post-editing and revising, because machines don't think. Machines, unfortunately, we know this from post-editing output, even neural MT, that because each sentence is translated in isolation, even if the bird is translated correctly as a bird, or maybe it's a pepper, but you might have 3 adjacent sentences with 3 different birds, right? So we have to train people when they're post-editing, even full post-editing, to be aware that the kinds of errors that a machine makes are very different from the kinds of errors that a human makes, in terms of the human will always make cognitive sense where the machine won't. Thank you.
Thank you very much for both of those comments. And I do have to say, I very much agree with the points here. And I think part of my problem, so full disclosure, I have recently ended up in the ISO committee TC37 that is responsible for these standards, and this kind of, I don't know, frustration, if we can call it that, perhaps partially arises from already the 17100, and I was kind of like perhaps hammering that one point about CAT tools a bit too much, because I can sort of, after having having heard some of the conversations that are going on in the technical committee, I understand now where they were going with that. So I understand the thinking behind it, but I think the way it is in the standard is currently confusing to a lot of people in the field. So it needs to be revised somehow. And I do see this difference in these situations. So my first suggestion, I think we need to get rid of this like note saying that if it's in a CAT tool, it's not post-editing, because that's just causing problems for everybody. And I do see a difference with this scenario where you have this kind of like the static machine translation that comes in the Trados package, and then that's all you work with, and then this whole situation where you're working with. And I think my main problem at the moment is that we don't have a good way to talk about this. Well, let's take Lommel's augmented translation then, for example. So this is kind of the other point that is causing confusion, that there are people who are calling this post-editing, and then we're getting this kind of mix up of various issues and expectations going on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we see there's some comments in the chat.
Okay, I don't actually see the chat myself here.
I just, because it's like a conversation.
Okay.
First, from Jiajun Chen, he said, how would you operationalize unnecessary changes especially in terms of acceptability of the target text, because some machine translation segments are acceptable for some translators, but not for others. And Dr. Kobe kind of replied, he said, unnecessary means that meaning is not changed. It's not about fluency, correct language use. And then Jadwin said, what prompts translators to introduce an unnecessary changes if the empty segment is acceptable in terms of fluency and the post editor edits the segment to make it even better? This kind of change can also be deemed as unnecessary change, I believe, but different post editors view acceptable machine translation segments differently. So what do you think, Dr. Koponen?
I think my response to all of that is simply yes. Exactly. Okay. That is exactly the problem we have here. So the way we, for example, defined or operationalized unnecessary in the study I mentioned there briefly was that we considered unnecessary change or unnecessary edit to be something that changes a machine translated segment that is already grammatical and fluent and conveys the correct meaning. So at least for some values of acceptable, the original machine translation suggestion would have been acceptable. However, as much as that seems like a simple definition, it's not. So exactly as is pointed out in these comments is that different people have different views of what is acceptable and what is not. And well, to give you a very brief description, so what we were doing in that study, we had 3 different people evaluating the same post edits and trying to make this categorization. Is this necessary or unnecessary? And there were situations where we agreed very easily, saying that, okay, yes, we all agree that this particular change was necessary, or we agree that this particular change was unnecessary. But there is a lot of gray area there trying to find it. So then we ended up basically voting it. So if there are 2 who disagree, then the 3rd person resolves that. So I don't have a good answer necessarily to how would you operationalize that in a explicit and final way, in a sense. As mentioned there, now I can see the comments in another. Of course, it also depends on what is expected of the final quality. And then if we move from our experiment with the students, if we go into thinking about professional workflows and situations, there are also things like, at least what I have encountered when I still worked as a professional translator, was that sometimes the client just had a specific idea that, well, this must be translated in this way because that's the way our organization does it, for example. And perhaps there were even some situations where my professional opinion as a translator was that my version was better than their version, but in the end, it's the client who decides it. Reception studies, like getting some sort of, I don't know, getting the actual end users of the translation involved in deciding what they consider acceptable for their purposes, that would be an even more interesting area then.
Yeah, so there's another hand raised, Ahmed.
Yes, Doctor, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, actually. You just touched on what I wanted to say, that the client sometimes has the final say of what kind of post-editing you need to perform on the translation. And sometimes they say minimal, and then what is minimal then? So I have been working in the field for so long now because we are working in the cloud. Sometimes you find that some segments, translation units are locked. You can't even perform the post-editing. So they say you just post-edit the first translation unit. And that's weird. And also, Dr. Copy has also touched on what I wanted to say. Also, sometimes the machine translation are performing better than the human translation. So these suggestions come from the neural machine translation, and you, oh my God, it's better than what I was thinking about. So is this post-editing? So I would join his voice to say it's revising for the first term, but not post-editing per se. One more thing is I wanted to ask you about. Are you aware of any estimation or scores that can be performed on the output of the translation that can measure the quality of the translation without comparing it to the source text?
Without comparing to source text.
Yes, a statistical measure, for example, like readability score, or a type token ratio, something around that sort. I worked on a project with the We Localize, and they did not look at the source translation at all. They were just performing some calculations, and they say this is acceptable. This needs to be revised. Are you aware of such measures?
I have to say that that's not an area I'm very familiar with. I'm on a very, very general level. I know that these tools, for example, measuring readability scores and such exist, but I would not be the best person to really speak to that. And I also had another thought there. Yes, actually, where you mentioned there in the beginning about these locked segments, or sometimes also remembering happening in my own work with translation memories, is that you sometimes get situations where, for example, the 100% are or locked and you're not supposed to change them at all, at least for me. So my main language pair when I was translating was English into Finnish. And there are so many situations where the English may be exactly the same, but the Finnish version, you need a different translation in a different context, not necessarily even meaning-wise, but simply grammar-wise. And that's caused all manner of problems. So I'm a bit hesitant to hear if there are situations now where they are also making the machine translation versions locked. Very good point from Jeffrey Kobe in the comments that monolingual tools measure fluency. They can't say anything about accuracy. So yes, if you're not comparing to the source text, then how do you know if it's correct or not?
Yeah, I agree. And also I saw Michael has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question with respect to that definition of translation and post-editing that Kobe suggested. I'm not sure whether I understood this correctly. So what I understood is that if a translator gets a job with a ready-made translation memory, and then the employer says, use this translation memory and do post-editing, that's post-editing. But if they get the text and generate the exactly same resource and do the exactly same work with the same MT suggestions and so on, but only they do it themselves, then it's translation, because they get the task is to translate, and it's up to the post editor or to the translator then to do this, and the other way around, they get the resource. Is that the difference then between post editing and translation? And then one cannot actually see in the activities the differences, but in the intention, in the job description. Is that meant to be the difference between post editing and translation?
Shall I take a crack at this since it was my
yes,
comment?
please.
It's a really key difference, because if you sort of understood it correctly, but it's not just definitional of the intent. It is a key difference in the output, because a complete machine translation contains the typical errors of neural machine translation that I mentioned. The same term will be inconsistently translated in adjacent sentences. There will be syntactic problems. The thing will translate names, things that no human would ever do. And so post-editing is a mindset that it's a mindset that addresses these specific kinds of problems that you must correct. You have to be aware of them and change them. But second, it retains that rule of preserve as much of the MT output as possible. And therefore, the post-edited machine text is the machine's output revised by a human, post-edited by a human that retains some of those features of the machine translation. The other one is a human creating a translation. This is the human creating the idea, understanding the source text in their mind, having an idea of what the text should say, and then choosing whether or not to accept the machine translation suggestion or the translation memory suggestion, or simply to reject them all and translate from scratch because neither of those suggestions are acceptable. So I think this is a fairly new distinction that we're making because of the relatively recent inclusion of MT suggestions into CAT tools. But I think if you did a study on a source text that was fully machine translated and then post-edited versus a text that was originally created by a human, I think you would see significant differences that probably have to do with cognition.
But then the question, so what you see in the sequence of activities, whether the person is translating or post-editing?
Oh yeah. The difference in activities is totally different because when you start with a machine translation, fully machine translated, the text is full. The right side of the CAT tool is full of text that's already there. It's no different on its surface than receiving a text for revision that's already been created by a human translator. But the problems are different. Whereas if the human is creating the translation, the right side is empty and the human is creating each segment based on those suggestions.
Okay, thank you. Then
I'll have to jump in. What if it's actually not empty? Because that's something that came up. So I don't have anything published, but some collaborations that I have been doing with, for example, translators at the Finnish Department of the European Parliament. And we had these discussions with them where some of them do actually populate the text fully from translation memory. So they have everything. So it's already full even when working with machine translation.
That can happen. You're right. Yeah. And I think that's a matter of confidence. I think that's a really big difference. For instance, I've been translating since 1995. And so my translation memory, my sort of big conglomerate translation memory has segments, thousands and thousands of segments. They're all translated or reviewed by me. I know they're right? As opposed to MT output, which has those problems. So if you're pre-populating your translation in an environment where you have confidence in the TM, you mentioned earlier, you can't be confident about a TM you get from somewhere because a lot of them are really bad. That's different from translating in an enclosed environment where you're using your own TM.
Here's another thought also. Somebody followed that talk last week, I think, in Surrey from Felix do Carmo, where he wonders whether translation is machine translation is translation actually. And my understanding of his argument is that machine translation is not translation, and it turns into a translation only through post-editing. I'm not sure what I should think of this, but this is another definition, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah, I know there have been some discussions which, for example, Felix Ducarmo has been bringing up. For example, should we, instead of machine translation, should we be talking about something else? He was recently suggesting, for example, to talk about artificial translation. I think I kind of get the thinking behind that. On the other hand, what I'm wondering about, if the problem is with the translation part, so is it translation or not? I'm not sure that replacing a machine with artificial necessarily solves it.
May I?
Of course.
Is translation, it depends on, it's a philosophical question. If the process of translation starts with understanding the source text, then machine translation is not translation, because the machines don't understand the source text. And we know that we've abandoned rules-based translation. Statistical machine translation is not translation because it just says, oh, well, this looks like that. Neural machine translation is similar. There is no understanding there. On the other hand, large corporations are taking raw MT output and putting it on their websites to allow users in multiple languages to access the help files in many languages, and they only correct those machine translations when the users complain that they can't fix the problem. So in that sense, functionally, yes, it's a translation.
Sorry, can I say something? I think this is a dangerous definition, because you would need to define what it means to understand. And I would think that also translators do not necessarily understand the text. So then, if this is the case, they don't produce translations either. I think that doesn't bring us further.
Oh, well, okay. Speaking as a professional translator, every machine never understands anything about the text. Every human, translator or not, who reads a text in a language they understand, understands the text and derives meaning from it. In punctual places, they misunderstand individual items. But as Maarit quite eloquently expressed it, a human would not think that a bird flying in the sky was suddenly a pepper flying in the sky. It just wouldn't happen. And that is the difference between humans and machines.
Thank you for that clear definition.
Yeah,
you're welcome.
Yeah, I had to kind of laugh at the question, like, do translators necessarily understand? Because I have sometimes joked that in my professional lives there have been situations where I've been translating something and it does not enter my brain. Like,
this goes right from the eyes to the fingers.
Yeah. Especially if it's something very, very familiar. It's just kind of.
That it doesn't mean it didn't go through your brain. It's just that you've automated the process so much that you don't need to cogitate about it. You just know it.
So some discussion in the comments about the guidelines, and yeah, it is kind of my feeling about all kinds of guidelines, and this is not necessarily only about post-editing guidelines, but just in general, giving guidelines and instructions to people. For example, giving instructions to my students how to do some tasks, or writing, for example, task descriptions for experiments. And so I'm starting to be of the opinion that there is no way to write any guidelines so that everybody would understand it the same way. There's always somebody is going to understand it in a different way. So while specifications and guidelines I believe are helpful, there's always this, as Kasim, who says that makes sense, could also be very relative. So for different people, different things are going to make sense in a translated sentence.
And then also there's another comment. I don't know if you see or not. She said, I'm not surprised about the result. This doesn't seem to have changed. Emma Wagner reported this when Sistron was first introducing the EC translation services in 1970s.
Yeah, I believe that relates to the discussion of these kind of psychological effects on translators. So there are, I mentioned at least one study, which was Lucas Vieira and Elisa Alonso. I remember them discussing something that the translators they studied felt very unsatisfied when they had to deal with, or at least often felt unsatisfied when they had to deal with this so-called good enough quality. And I think there have been others as well who report these experiences. That was the first one I could think of.
Yeah, I also have a question. So just now you are mentioning, so everyone maybe have different understanding of the same guidelines or style guide. If we are doing an experiment and we want to control this, we give the translators or participants different style guides or different post-editing guidelines. For example, we say one group of people get good enough guidelines and one group of people get human translation quality. But if they have different kinds of expectations for good enough or human translation quality, then how can we control and how can we explain our results? Yeah.
Yeah, that again, I have to say that's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer that question. I know there has been also some work. I think it was Marianne Flanagan and others in Denmark who were also kind of like going through those this whole question of how do people actually understand these guidelines, and I believe they were also working with students. So getting different students' understandings of if they are given these different post-editing guidelines, how do they actually understand them and how would they work? And I believe they had these then like conversations after the fact and comparisons and try to get, I don't know if consensus is the correct word, but somehow have different people talk to each other about how they understand it and how they should do it. And this is something, as I mentioned, I've had some interactions with the Finnish translators at the European Parliament, for example, and this is something that I suggested to them as they were starting post-editing at that point, was to kind of maybe what you need is, in addition to these general guidelines, is something where you all try this and then you have conversations. Yes, that's the paper by Flanagan and Christensen. And then have these discussions of how you, as this specific department, are going to handle things. And so maybe something like that, but of course that doesn't apply to all situations. And if you're dealing with something like an experimental setting, then of course having your experimental participants discuss it with each other is going to affect your results. But it might be an interesting experiment in other ways.
Thank you. So there is another question maybe from Ahmed. He said there is the issue of the impact of machine translation on the human translator's translation style. Would being exposed to empty output make changes to the psyche of the human translators?
Perhaps the question of psyche goes into an area that I am not very familiar with. Perhaps others who have a stronger background in cognitive studies can comment to that. In stylistic terms, there are studies that show that the machine does affect translators' style. So I mentioned there the concepts of translationese and then machine translationese, and then others have started to bring out the term post-editese as well, as something that has specific features that come specifically from post-editing.
Okay.
So yeah, I know that there are conversations and papers discussing this question of does being exposed to machine translation affect people's thinking and language in general, but it's not something I've specifically worked on.
Okay, so there is a follow-up question, I guess, from Ahmed. So in a way, we are being reprogrammed by Google Translate.
Yeah, I was going to say that if we have to be reprogrammed by something, maybe not Google Translate, let's at least pick a better translation system. I don't know. I mean, there are conversations. I've seen some work now. I'm sorry, the name escapes me, from Dublin City University, Andy Way and someone else. For example, looking at language learners and how their language is getting affected by using machine translation, and there is some other work in this direction as well. So there is some interesting things out there.
All right, and I think this concludes the colloquium. We have a nice conversation here, and thank you for your great talk, Dr. Koponen. And thanks for everyone's attending this session. Very lively, thorough discussion. Okay, thank you so
yes,
much.
thank you also from me. This was a very interesting conversation to have with you all.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good evening, Maarit.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.